Hey guys, so this is the start of the new content that will be examined in the upcoming SAC, and it's all about chronic adaptations. So chronic adaptations, just before I go into the chapter and we look at any of the specifics and intricate details, chronic meaning long-term, adaptation meaning change, long-term changes that take place in the body due to training programs. There's a lot of little intricate details within this chapter, which is why I've chosen to take screenshots or scans of every page and really break it down with you to a deep level. Because the levels of questions in the multiple choice and short answer that you're going to get will ask you specifics about what's going on here. So having a really good understanding at the broad sense of an athlete trains, and at the end of their 6-week training program, if progressive overload has taken place and all of the training principles were adhered to, chronic adaptations will have taken place. That athlete is a more finely tuned athlete. So what we're doing now is we're looking at, okay, so what is actually changing inside the body to let this athlete have this improved performance? So let's get straight into it. The knowledge that you're going to need for this chapter is what are the actual chronic adaptations, what are the changes in the cardiovascular, respiratory, and muscular systems, and how they relate to both aerobic, anaerobic, and resistance style training. So it's about which type of training to use to get the change that you actually want. Just regular training or doing any style of training will not get you the change that you want. And the skills that you need is to be able to explain how each of those changes lead to improved performance. It has to always come back to improved performance. So as I said, there's changes that take place in the cardiovascular, the respiratory, and the muscular systems, calling upon your knowledge from year 11 PE. And all three of those change areas will improve performance. Now, I've already gone ahead and underlined a few things to save me time here, but I really need to explain a few things to you. So chronic adaptations are the physiological, they are the physical changes that happen when we increase the demands on the body. So if the body is just going through maintenance and we are not overloading the body to new training conditions, then changes won't take place. The changes and the adaptations can either be structural or functional. That means the actual structure changes or how it works and how it's efficient can change. But either way, it leads to improved performance. And as I said earlier, it is specific to the type of training, whether it be aerobic, anaerobic, or resistance training. Let's have a look here. An anaerobically trained athlete. That means that they're doing sprint, rest, sprint, rest, sprint, rest. They will have a thicker wall in their ventricle compared to an untrained athlete. But endurance or aerobically trained athletes will actually have a larger ventricle area. So you can see already that if somebody does sprint, stop, sprint, stop, sprint, stop, their heart becomes stronger. If somebody runs at a lower intensity for a longer duration, then the actual size of the ventricle increases. So depending on the style of training, depends on what change takes place. So you can also already start to see that giving an athlete both anaerobic and aerobic training will increase not only the strength because of the wall, because this is a muscle, but also the size of the heart. So if we have a look here in this flowchart diagram, if we have an increased left ventricle size, which is this one here, we would have an increased blood volume in that left ventricle. That's the structure change, and that's the function change. And if we have an increase in the thickness of that left wall, which is this anaerobic training, then we would have a stronger muscle contraction of that left ventricle. So whether the muscle itself of the heart is able to store more blood, or whether it's able to have a stronger push when that blood is ejected out of the heart. Either way, we are going to have an increased amount of blood coming out of that left ventricle every time the heart beats. So we have structure changes and we have function changes. Here's a summary of all of the changes that take place. Now, this is not just the cardiovascular system. This is respiratory and muscular as well, for if somebody is completing endurance running. So long distance, slower intensity running, the lungs, they will increase in their size. That means we will have an increased diffusion into the bloodstream. We have an increased efficiency of extracting oxygen and carbon dioxide from air, and therefore we actually have more oxygen coming into the body. And the heart will increase in size and volume, which means that we will have a lower resting heart rate, and I'll talk about that momentarily, and a higher stroke volume. That's the focus of today's lesson. The stomach itself will actually have decreased blood flow to other organs like the digestive system, because it's more efficient. The muscles will have more capillaries in the slow twitch fibers, which means those slow twitch fibers will get more oxygen because they have an increased fiber size because the muscles are working more. Therefore, we will have more oxygen coming out of the blood, so an AVO2 difference will be higher. There is more fuel stored in the muscle because the muscle has a bigger size. And we also have more enzymes in the muscle which speed up those reactions. And the blood itself, there will actually be more blood in the body because we are able to store a higher amount of plasma, and therefore we will have a higher amount of hemoglobin, which is a carrier of oxygen. So because of this, we will have less lactate production. So a lot of these things is one thing leads to another, which leads to another, which means that it's not one change that takes place, it's lots of changes that take place in the body. And if the athlete is able to sustain that training for 6 weeks or more, then the changes will be long term and they will stay around for that athlete. So chronic adaptations take place in both respiratory, cardiovascular, and muscular systems, and they all aim to improve performance. So let's now look specifically at the long-term changes or chronic adaptations based off of aerobic training. And in summary, if we are training aerobically, then we are improving the efficiency of the aerobic energy system. And the aerobic energy system provides oxygen to muscles so that we can stay within the aerobic energy system for longer and at higher intensities without having to call upon an increased reliance on the anaerobic energy systems and either deplete phosphate creatine or build up too much lactate and hydrogen ions, which we know fatigue and recovery mechanisms that kick in there. So the actual cardiovascular, which is the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood changes that take place. Let's look at just the heart right now. You've heard this word hypertrophy. It is the growth of a muscle. So when we say cardiac hypertrophy, we remember that the heart itself is a muscle. That means it is a muscle fiber that squeezes. And so cardiac hypertrophy refers to increased size of the heart muscle. And as you saw in that first diagram, either the wall thickness can improve if you are doing anaerobic training. We're now talking about aerobic training, so we're actually talking about an increased size in the heart, which leads to an increased size in the left ventricle, which is the area in which blood squirts out of the heart to distribute out to the muscles of the body. So because there's an increased size in the left ventricle, we actually have a larger cardiac output. Now, a reminder here that cardiac output is Q, and cardiac output refers to stroke volume times heart rate. Stroke volume is the amount of blood being ejected from that left ventricle every beat, and heart rate is how many beats per minute. So if we multiply them together, Q, or cardiac output, is the amount of blood leaving the heart per minute. Now, what's really interesting here is you can't just say that cardiac output, heart rate, and stroke volume all increase or all decrease. Because the heart needs to listen to the demand of oxygen at the muscle site and change its heart rate accordingly, when we look at rest, submaximal exercise, under maximum, and maximal exercise, each of those changes is different. Because when you are at rest and your muscles are not requiring much energy and therefore much oxygen, there is no need to increase the output from the heart because the muscles don't need that oxygen at that time. And yet when we're exercising, whether it be submaximal or maximally, the muscles do require oxygen. And if we have larger muscles, they require more oxygen. So therefore, the heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output will need to change. So we need to look into, well, do they increase or do they decrease? One thing to think about here is a word called bradycardia, which is actually referring to having a decreased heart rate. So think about this. When we have a highly trained athlete, their heart rate at rest will be much lower than ours. We've heard before how endurance and marathon runners can have a resting heart rate of 50 beats per minute or lower. And our resting heart rate, if I looked at mine right now, might be around that 65 to 70 because I do a fair bit of running. And some of you guys might have a resting heart rate of 78, 79 beats per minute. As you train more and you train aerobically or endurance running or cycling or swimming or skiing or rowing, each of those continuous movement actions for long periods of time will lead to a decreased heart rate at rest. The heart does not have to beat as many times per minute to be able to get the amount of oxygen to the muscles that it requires. So right now, as I sit here, my muscles require very little oxygen. Before my training program, my heart had to beat a few extra times per minute to get that same amount of oxygen to the muscles. Now my heart can beat slower because with every beat, more blood is coming out because I know with aerobic training, my heart has grown in size. So if we look at this now, cardiac output can remain unchanged, but heart rate decreases. There must have been an increase in stroke volume. So this equation, if the cardiac output, the amount of oxygen and blood coming out of the heart per minute, is going to stay the same at rest. Because my heart is bigger, more blood can come out per beat, then less beats need to occur in that minute. There's a couple of things that we can look at here. The left ventricle is bigger. There is reduced cardiac and arterial stiffness. The heart is more efficient at beating because it's used to beating more because you've put it under more stress during running. There is actually an increased diastolic filling time. We'll talk about diastole and systole in a minute. But essentially, because the heart is beating less, when it is not beating and it is opening up, there's more time for more blood to go inside the heart. So in the next squeeze, more blood can actually come out. When it's beating faster, that actual fill time is much lower. And finally, there is increased contractility, the ability for the heart to actually contract. So when we talk about diastole or diastolic, that is talking to the resting phase of a heartbeat where the ventricle fills with blood. And when we talk about systole, we're talking about when the blood is ejected because the heart is squeezing. The contraction is more forceful, the area is larger, more blood has filled in it. You can see how this is all making the heart more efficient. So if we just now go down to this table here, knowing that heart rate times stroke volume equals cardiac output, and we just look at rest, because the ventricle size has increased, that means that the amount of blood to come out per beat will have increased. Also because it's filled with more, because there's a longer rest in the diastole and there's more contractility on all of those aspects. Heart rate itself will decrease so that the cardiac output will have no change. Might say slight decrease because the muscle is actually more efficient and therefore less blood needs to come out of the heart. But essentially no change, because this decreases and this increases, this should stay the same. Now, because I'm a more efficient runner and my heart is more efficient, then sub-maximally training underneath your maximum or in a comfort zone of that 70% or maybe even a little lower, there will be still a decrease in the actual number of beats per minute of my heart. I will also have a decreased recovery heart rate, which means it goes back to its resting levels quicker. And my steady state heart rate, when I'm training in the aerobic system and I'm staying at that constant intensity, will have a decrease as well. This is all due to the stroke volume having an increase. But I want you to think about this. If the heart has a maximum amount of beats per minute that it is capable of doing, it doesn't lose that. The heart may be able to beat at 190 beats per minute, and we can do our 220 minus our age to find out something that's close to that number. It doesn't lose its ability to be able to beat 190 times per minute. And so if we look at that, with now an increase in stroke volume, when we're at our maximum, because we still have an increase in the amount that's coming out per minute, there is no change in what my maximum heart rate can get to. This staying the same and this increasing will still lead to a higher cardiac output at the end of the day. So the heart is much more efficient even when we get to that maximal exercise intensity. So all of this here is referring to exactly what I've explained in that table, and I feel as if that might be where we leave it at today, just looking at aerobic training and the size of the heart and what that means to the equation of cardiac output, stroke volume, and heart rate. It's a lot to take in, and I want to give the opportunity for you to come onto a Zoom chat and talk to me about it. So I'm going to open the Zoom up. If you're feeling super comfortable and confident with what you've just heard, then you can go on with some peak and some Ed Rollo stuff for the remainder of the lesson. But I'd love to hear from you about thoughts, issues, concerns. Next lesson, Tuesday of next week, there's going to be a lot of content continuing on with this Chronic Adaptations chapter and moving away from aerobic training, but also looking at what else changes within the blood and the blood vessels because of that whole cardiovascular system. Today we were just introducing what chronic adaptations actually are and the fact that training a certain way will elicit different changes, and those changes can occur in 3 different systems within the body, and then look into detail about the heart itself during aerobic training and what does this mean to different aspects of the heart when we go back to acute responses, small term changes during an actual training session. I hope this is all making sense to you. Feel free to join the Zoom and clarify anything with me.